Welcome, everyone, to the Cancer Education Series, sponsored by Mercy One Cancer Center and Above and Beyond Cancer. I'm Dick Deming. I'm Medical Director of the Mercy One Cancer Center and founder of Above and Beyond Cancer. The Cancer Education Series is supported by a grant from the Iowa Cancer Consortium. So welcome. Our guest this evening is Kathy Koenig. Kathy is from Des Moines. She got her bachelor's degree in social work at Iowa State and her master's in counseling at Drake. She's worked as a medical social worker, a family therapist, and a counselor. And our topic tonight is about caregivers and caregiver support. So welcome, Kathy.
Thank you very much for having me.
So tell us, how did you get interested in caregivers, in supporting caregivers?
You know, working with family caregivers has been, I think, in the arc of my professional life, always been an undercurrent. When I was actively as a as a medical social worker, that was what I did. Is I worked with families, I helped assess their situation, what they needed, helped with discharge planning, and also relayed all that information to the team. So there was some seamlessness in that. And then when I was a therapist, both as a family therapist and individual therapist, I had a tendency, or certainly an interest in working with people who had health-related issues. So a lot of that came my way in our group practice, and so I helped people work through those.
So maybe
issues.
we should define caregiver. So there's different definitions. So for example, as a doctor, I'm a professional caregiver, but I think our intent tonight is to talk really more about the lay caregiver, that some people might think of the husband and the wife, but obviously it's a bigger, broader group of people than just the family member you're living with.
Exactly, and I'm really glad that you framed it that way. I tend to see it, when I'm working with people, I tend to talk about circles of caregiving and see that in concentric circles. And it isn't always a spouse. There isn't always a family member present or available. I think that caregivers can sometimes be your neighbors, they can be your coworkers, they can be friends. And you're also still a caregiver even if your family member is in a care facility. So it's not a matter always of giving somebody physical care. It can be decision making, bill paying, those kinds of things qualify as caregiving.
Yeah, as a cancer doctor, I see it all the time. The cancer doesn't just affect the person who has the diagnosis. It affects the whole family, and as you pointed out, it's not just the family that they're living with, but the entire family. And you're right, it's even if someone is in a medical facility with paid caregivers giving 24/7 care, you still need your circle of caregivers. In the hospitals nowadays, I mean, oh my gosh, there is a big shortage of staff, and I see it, the patients who are just all alone, only relying on the paid staff, are at a big disadvantage compared to those who have a family member in the room who's helping everyone keep on track of everything.
Yeah, as we sort of began to work into the pandemic, that was one of the things that just came uppermost to my mind, was not only, how patients were going to be handling that, but how that was going to be an impact on the paid caregivers, the professional caregivers in the system, who were used to doing beautiful work, but they were now going to have the additional expectations or hopes and dreams of a family that some of that extra care would be available too. And I know that that's been really challenging for everybody to meet the demands.
So as you know, this is Cancer Education Series, and I'm a cancer doctor, but we obviously aren't going to limit our conversation about caregiver support and caregivers to just cancer. I think anyone that has gone through the aging of their parents has probably taken on some responsibilities in the realm of caregiver. Whether or not your aging parents thought they needed your support and caregiving.
Exactly. Well, before the pandemic, the numbers had just come out from AARP and the National Alliance on Caregiving that we had jumped from 45 point some million caregivers in the U.S. alone to over 53 million caregivers, family caregivers, just in the U.S., and you can expand that out globally. So the numbers are there, and yet a lot of people don't even consider or identify themselves as caregivers. But you're right, if I talk to somebody about caregiving, even if they're not caregiving now, or they're sort of anticipating it in the future, they know somebody who is a caregiver, or they can reflect back and say like, oh my gosh, yeah, I saw how exhausted my mother became working and trying to deal with her mother, etc. And so, there are lots of social dynamics, economic dynamics that come into play with this too.
Yeah, so it really does come down to the care. So I think of one couple that I interacted with today, and the wife doesn't have cancer. The husband does, and the amount of physical care she provides, emotional care, logistical support, as she's also trying to keep her professional career alive and doing everything else that needs to be done. Maybe let's go through some of the dynamics of caregiving. What are some things that we might have wrong as we think of what a caregiver is?
Well, once again, I think when people say, but I'm not taking care of somebody, I'm not doing physical care, I'm not having to take them to the bathroom or lift them, etc., so I'm not caregiving. But it is that decision making, and it is those, you're doing a lot of logistics. You have now rearranged your schedule to accommodate, taking people to appointments or just managing things in their life. Perhaps you're grocery shopping for them, etc. But it's almost like there's this low-grade ticker tape that's at the bottom of your life that kind of goes up and down because you're thinking about the needs or what could happen or what's going to be needed next, trying to manage. I think one of the things that sometimes people underestimate around it is the preparation that I really like seeing happen ahead of time or thinking about, where people have at least had conversations about, if I needed a caregiver, is that something you would do for me? And getting an agreement around that instead of necessarily making assumptions, because sometimes that's where we go a bit off the rails, thinking, of course, you're my sister, you'll take care of me, when in fact, that is not what this person has intended to do. Mm-hmm. And so there's sometimes lots of expectations and a lot of feelings that go along with that.
And I see it a lot, let's say the patient is widowed, and so is living alone and is already starting to experience some physical decline, and there's kids, and this is probably sexist to say, but I think everybody should have a daughter. And have a daughter who is a nurse is kind of like the ideal situation, where you have someone who is just kind of that sort of super mom, but a lot gets put on their shoulders, and I think sometimes the sons get a pass on the situation of what can everyone do, and who is the one who should be that person who comes in. So how do you help families kind of sort through that and then deal with maybe some of the consequences of some folks feeling that they're doing more than their share of what needs to be done to support mom through her illness and through all of the physical, emotional, psychological, philosophical, spiritual, financial needs that she may be experiencing?
Yeah, I was leading a group yesterday, and there was a woman who had come to the group, and she lost her mother last year, but she came to the group, she said, because I read your bio that you worked with caregivers, and I thought maybe you could help me with that. And her mother's been gone for many months, but she's still struggling with a lot of residual feelings and issues about what caregiving took out of her. But as we talked, part of what came up were the sibling dynamics. And I almost find it to be the exception rather than the rule that siblings mesh well in terms of deciding what they will take on and spell each other. And so I think it's very common, and in a lot of caregivers groups, that comes up, the sibling dynamic. And I think it becomes I've taken the work of Gretchen Rubin and her 4 tendencies and looked at that, and it's like there are certain tendencies that fall into like really good caregiver categories and others not so much. But I think, and so then sometimes when you can identify that a little bit, it helps you identify this person is probably not going to be the person who will be best suited for this, but they're going to be well suited for another role. So helping people too to find a way that there's another role that they might be able to fulfill. Sometimes because people live at some distance, they aren't able to participate at, say, the same level as somebody who's maybe living with a parent in their house. And I think of a situation I know of where the mother was living with a daughter in California. Son lived in California, but Northern California, and the daughter in New Mexico. The daughter in New Mexico was the nurse, but she had severe back issues. She could barely take she would be in great pain flying there. But the son took on the responsibility of putting in a camera system in the house so that when the other daughter had to go to work, anybody could watch mom. And they were, the cameras were in appropriate places, but it allowed them to observe and make sure she was safe and alerted them. So part of his participation was economic. So sometimes that's a way somebody can participate and take some of that burden off of somebody else.
As you described the role different people play, I'm reminded of a patient of mine who was, young and fit and healthy, but going to be partially incapacitated by all of the chemotherapy, and good group of friends, and everybody her friends all wanted to help, but they're sort of like, what can I do to help? And well, I don't need anything. And the solution is, let's give you a specific assignment. How about dinner on Thursday? How about picking up the groceries that I've ordered online on Friday? How about picking up my daughter and taking her to dance class? So all of the folks that want to help, it's better if you have assignments that are actually going to provide you some help as opposed to just kind of being there to want to do something.
Yeah, that's where there are some really great new tools that are, I think, extraordinarily helpful for that. There are some free apps that I recommend to caregivers, and there's 3 or 4 different ones. I think they're all really good. There's one, though, that's specifically designed for millennial caregivers, who are the 2nd largest group of caregivers in this country.
What's the largest group?
Boomers.
The boomers, okay.
Boomers.
Yeah.
So, but those millennials,
We boomers, yeah.
millennials are closing in on us. And they have some different issues, because for many of them too, they're trying to get their careers started or whatever, and they're taking care of a parent. They're feeling overwhelmed. A lot of caregivers feel isolation anyway. But apps, there's some wonderful apps that you can use that can help identify specific things that you might need help with, and you'll have people signed up as members, and you can identify who you also want to get alerts, and then that allows somebody to just sign up right away. There's no having to make a phone call, having to text, because as caregivers so often you'll be like, oh, let me know if I can help, and they're always like, I don't know, and then it's in the moment that they need help, or they can identify like, oh yes, I wish somebody would. Boy, would somebody just bring my garbage cans back from the end of the driveway? It's icy and snowy and I can't get outside. And those kinds of things where people are able to care and help out are meaningful and helpful. But yeah, the apps, I love recommending those
so
to
the
people.
Boomer app is a piece of paper that goes on the magnet of your refrigerator, your to-do list. So the millennial apps, do you have the names of some that you could mention?
iAlly is the one for
iAlly?
Yeah, hyphen ally, A-L-L-Y. But boomers are very skilled with our technology too. So Carely, C-A-R-E-L-Y is another one, and another one is Iana Care, which is I Am Not Alone Care,
Okay.
I-A-N-A-C-A-R-E. So those would be three I would start off with top of mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've talked before we came on camera, and you came up with some things that you call myths about caregiving. And I thought we'd go through some of those. So one of the myths is that family members are the folks best prepared to be the caregivers.
And sometimes they are. Sometimes they are well prepared. And that preparation also needs to include documents. It needs to be able to have the conversations with somebody about, powers of attorney and getting those things in line. Payable on deaths, on banks, so that you don't have to go through a bunch of hoops to have access to finances. But HIPAA things, and having a lot of that digitized, and I have resources for people to do that too. But sometimes we have families, and families are no different in a situation of illness than they are at any other time, like including holidays. So sometimes there are difficult relationships, and we don't have the level of connection that might be the type of connection we would want for a caregiver situation, or we are at a great distance. There are mental health issues, there are substance abuse issues that crop up that make somebody not the best identified caregiver. So that's when, at least for me, I like to kind of go back to that model of circles and say, who are the people in your life that we can pull in, and what roles can they take on? And some people will be in those very core central roles of maybe physical care, or going back and managing some intimate function of your life, like your finances. And then there are more external circles where these might be your friends who would do transportation or who would bring food. And then our outer circles where even it might be, you might not even know the outer circle people right away. They may come from that middle circle who'll say, I know somebody who can do this, or I've got a guy, or whatever. And your circle just builds. And that way you're not alone. And the people at the very center cannot have to be so exhausted by it, or so worried, or just overwhelmed by anything. And people can kind of dance in and out of roles in those situations.
And one thing that everyone will experience as they help people through difficult times is those individuals who have always been the doer and the one to turn to are often not the ones who want to reach out for help.
Yes.
But as I always remind them, you're doing a favor. You have been giving and giving and giving. People that you have given to want the opportunity to give back. And if you'll just allow them, give them assignments that are really meaningful, that will help you, but you're actually giving them the gift of doing something nice for you.
Yeah. And for a patient, I think that's a really good point. One of the things I think that can be helpful too is that sometimes if it's just you and somebody you're caring for in a house, 24/7, that gets old and you get tired of each other. So sometimes bringing in a little fresh blood, somebody that can come in who's a friend, who can watch a movie with you or bring you lunch, and so you can get out and go do something, and they actually can have a very positive interaction with somebody besides you, and it just takes that pressure off. It helps relieve it.
So let's talk a little bit about supporting caregivers. You identified that there's burnout that happens. There's frustrations. There's, no matter how empathetic and compassionate a person is, there is a need for support. And so again, in the world of cancer, it's like the caregiver's like, yeah, but the person I'm helping has incurable cancer. I don't want to ask for help because my needs are really small in comparison. What's the best way to support caregivers?
I think one of the things that I find is first just asking them how they are. And they will almost immediately begin to tell you how their patient is. Mm-hmm. And they say, well, no, that's it, but I want to know how you are. And really? You want? So it's the being heard. I love it when I can get them together in a group. I can almost sit back because they begin to mesh and tell their stories, and they do not have to have the same dynamics or the same diagnosis or anything, but they get each other. They have a language, they have a knowing about one another, and they see one another. When I think we are seen and heard and felt by somebody, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm not invisible, and this is helping me. And
so when you get a group together, a group of caregivers and basically a support group, what are some of the common themes that they talk about?
Exhaustion.
Physical exhaustion.
Yeah, they're just exhausted, worry. And then somebody will inevitably bring up the things that nobody wants to talk about or they don't feel as appropriate, like what will people think? And they're like, I'm angry about this, or
my life has been taken
yeah,
away.
I've lost my life, and I can't complain about that because, as you said, somebody else has it worse. And what will people think? And people on the outside are telling me what a good job I'm doing all the time. So, I can't say, hold on, I don't feel that way, or I don't feel that way today. I have to keep this nice face on all the time. But then when I can come in here, I can say, whatever, and nobody is shocked or appalled. People are like, yeah. And nobody is saying anything that they're going to harm anybody or themselves, or they're just expressing normal human emotions. And being able to do that and just get it out is part of it. I think, the other thing too is collaborative problem solving without telling somebody what they should do. Because the shoulds also just layer on the guilt.
Right.
And
here's what you should do.
Caregivers are just stalked by it.
Mm-hmm. But getting together in a group is, let me just tell you what we did, and here's how we dealt with that problem, and what resources, what other ideas. Yeah. Exactly.
They are. I don't know. They touch my heart nonstop with their generosity towards one another. Never do they sit back and think well, I've got a resource and I'm not sharing that with you. It's always oh, here, I've got something for you. Or, yeah, exactly, here's a strategy we tried. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't take them long to become connected with one another and start meeting outside of a group, or coming early and saving a place, or staying later if they can because their time is so compressed, and hanging out in the parking lot and talking to one another.
And as you know, everyone's kind of understanding of how much they want other people to know about them, their sense of privacy. Yes. So I remember one patient and her husband, and it was going to keep the cancer diagnosis secret from the grown children and everyone in the community. And of course, everyone knew, but they didn't acknowledge it and didn't talk about it. So it ended up, you talk about these growing circles, nobody could join in because they decided it was going to be a secret. And so to try to help would be to let them know that it wasn't a secret.
Right. I think that speaks to another myth, which is that we all have the same values around caregiving or around illness, that we would all share it with everyone and talk about it and allow people in. And that isn't necessarily true. And I've come across that in a couple of situations where it's been sort of like this super secret, except for maybe a couple of people who then feel quite burdened by carrying the secret. But yeah, it's that piece of thinking well, boy, if that were my diagnosis, here's what I'd be doing, and I'd be marching off and having this done, and why aren't they doing that? And allowing one another, even if that's within a couple, to say, really, I want you to go do this, and the other person's like, no, I don't want to. Having to also respect the choices someone else is making, and
Yeah, lots of different philosophies of what to do and
Right.
how, we're going through it now with COVID too. And the two poles of throw caution to the wind and overabundance of caution, and how do you find the middle path? I remember distinctly a young couple, a middle-aged couple, and she was going through treatment and was getting chemo and immunosuppressed, but they had tickets that they had had for 6 months to go see Cher in concert at Wells Fargo. And he calls me and said, so here's her white count, and do we go to the concert or not go? And how bad did she? Oh, she really, well, some risks, there's no such thing as risk-free living.
Yeah.
And some risks are just worth taking. They went to the concert. They had a fabulous time. She did die of her cancer a few months later, but every time I see him, he talks to me about how grateful he was that I said some risks are worth taking. And that's just an example
Yeah.
of, there's not a right or wrong, and I'm sure, I have no doubt that many oncologists would have said, no, don't go to the Cher concert. I mean, for God's sakes, this is your life, and that's just a Cher concert. But a Cher concert can mean different things to different people.
That's right. It's like that's what's part of someone's life, and so, if somebody has weeks or and I can't judge what's important to them to do at that point in time, or whether they decide I don't want to go through any more treatment.
And one of the myths that we're talking about right now is that we don't all share the same values, expectations, when it comes to how aggressive or not aggressive to be. What are some of the other things that would fall in the realm of that myth that about values and expectations and philosophies?
I think sometimes where we can get tripped up about that can be just even with our lineage, our families, like what people have done or what people have expected, and doing something different can be challenging because, and I think for a caregiver, it's sort of like if their loved one decides to not take on maybe a form of treatment, then it's like how, what am I as a caregiver going to do? Like, or I'm going to feel terrible if you don't do this, or not like you're making me look bad, but I don't want to lose you. I'm fearful about what will happen, and how do two people or how do several people resolve that?
Yes. And sometimes in the cancer world, especially as when you're taking care of someone with incurable cancer, and incurable cancer may mean you have a decade, but it also may mean you don't, and even the most aggressive treatment is not going to cure the cancer, but may cause significant worsening of quality of life. And where do we all come down on quality versus quantity? Not a right or wrong answer, but sometimes you can have some disparity in how to make those decisions, even between the married couple or the closest caregiver.
Yeah, and I often think that fear is probably the biggest emotion that's underneath that there's that fear of like, what if we went this way, we would have this option or outcome or this, and we can't know. And so it requires some level of trust and allowing people self-determination.
Yeah, I bet 10 times a day I say to my patients, you're the boss, I work for you. I'm going to give you options and guidance, and I'll even give you recommendations, but you're in control. You can't make a good decision without knowing what the options are and the consequences, but you're the boss. One other myth that you mentioned was that the myth that, oh, everyone will step up and be a caregiver.
Yeah, it is a myth. It simply doesn't always happen, and I think that there's a frustration too when we have an expectation or a desire that somebody's going to step up and do that and they don't. Or and that's where I think communicating and helping people communicate the expectations or the possibilities is really important. Sometimes too, somebody might say, "Oh yes, yes, I want to do everything I can for you," and then
Right. It's the right answer, but then
it's like,
then their
where are
absence
you? But
is-
then and then that absence, you don't always understand the absence. What is the absence about? And it may be that the absence is related to like, oh my gosh, I would like to help, but now I'm afraid to. I'm afraid I don't know what to do. I don't have the capacity for it. I don't feel the capability. So I don't feel confident, which is what I try to help people with, just from that very basic. Let's see what your capacity is. Let's start here and see if we can help that grow. Sometimes what can happen is somebody may even start out as a caregiver and something happens in their life or happens to their health, and now that's compromised. And so where are we then? And that's where you have to really kind of go towards some expansion of your system, which a lot of people resist. I hear that a lot of times from caregivers, that they have wanted to expand the system, and the person they're caring for says, "Oh, no, we don't need that.
Yeah.
No, you can do it. You're doing a great job.
Yes,
No, we don't
yes.
need that." Or they'll go to the doctor or tell a nurse or another professional, like, "Oh, no, my daughter's doing, she'll do that, or my wife will do that," and yet those people haven't been consulted.
Yeah, that
And-
story reminds me of a lovely note I got from a woman whose husband just died, but he had a long journey with incurable cancer, and over years became more debilitated and requiring a lot more physical. And every meeting we would talk about, what brings joy to your life, but also what are the needs in the house. And with your diagnosis, we could bring hospice home care in and provide through insurance these services. No, my wife is doing just fine. And it kind of put an end to the discussion. He doesn't want strangers,
Yeah.
professionals to come in
Yeah.
the house. And then ultimately he agreed, and it ended up providing them both with needed services and a sense of comfort and relief. And eventually he transitioned from hospice home care to hospice facility care at the end. But it's always easier to make that transition if you already have hospice involved,
Yeah.
and the nurses are seeing and anticipating. And also in the world of hospice, there's this thing called respite care, where you're still at home getting hospice care, but you know what? Let's just bring you in for a few days, and it's really respite for the caregiver, who's been 24/7 doing the care, and by the patient going into the facility for a while gives some respite to the caregiver.
Yeah, and the respite for the caregiver in those situations comes without, I think, quite as much guilt, and they're allowed to have some of that relief. I recently have been working with a person who was in a caregiver group, and she's now transitioned to a grief group that I do because her husband passed away. But in that process, she was very. They had hospice care for several months, and he was declining, and we were kind of watching this, and she could come and talk about her fear. Like, she's like, I don't know what to expect, and I'm really afraid I'm going to get this wrong or this or that, we gave her some cues about, here's some questions to go ask, the hospice nurse, and the hospice staff, so you can know what it is you're doing, and you can gauge whether or not this is something you can manage, and should you take a look at the hospice house facility too, because I think too, sometimes at really those end of life moments, one of the things I talked to her about seemed to resonate for her, and that was, at that point in time, she wanted to just be his wife. She did not want to be his caregiver.
Yeah.
In those last, as it turned out, he did end up dying at home. And she had gone out for a walk and came back home, and she noticed a change in him, and she went to call the nurse, and by the time she was off the phone, he was gone. And so it wasn't the traumatic experience that she feared, but I think there's also that dynamic that happens for people that we don't always talk about, that the roles for people and their relationship changes when you go into that caregiver role, because sometimes now you're like the boss and you will do this and you will do that. And I don't know, I'm sure you see this, but some patients are resistant to that, particularly if it's coming from their spouse or their child, like, you're not the boss of me, versus if it's like the physical therapist who says, let's go for a walk. Okay. But yeah, it's that ability to be like, I just want to be your wife today, or I just want to be your husband today. And it's all of I've really started to weave a lot of grief work into my caregiver work, because there are so many losses that are happening along the way. And then when you begin to talk about that for them, man, they're like, it makes so much sense to them.
And there is a lot of pressure that is put on, a lot of decision making that feels like pressure. Let's say a patient who is in hospice home care, and you've got 3 different medicines that are on as needed for pain, as needed for anxiety, and you're trying to decide what to give with this sense of, oh, what if I give too much, and should I be giving? And they could be doing everything exactly right, but they don't know they're doing things right. So even if they're doing it right, they have this sense of, I'm not sure if I'm doing it right. And they get so caught up in the act of being the doctor and pharmacist that they lose the ability to just be the TLC and provide loving attention.
Yeah, I think one of my good friends said one of the most helpful and important things that she heard from a hospice nurse was, you can't screw this up. You can't screw this up. And it just relieved her and her brother, who actually were marvelous caregiver siblings, of that worry that somehow they were going to overdose their mom, or they were going to, like, it's like, no, you can't mess this up.
Yeah.
And she talked to me about that many times afterwards. That stayed with her as a message, and I was glad.
And that's a particular situation, yes, where, the goal is a peaceful death. And, in other situations where someone is, going through, let's say, stage 3 breast cancer with really strong chemotherapy, curative intent, the goal is to get you through this and survive, and there can be all sorts of emergencies along the way that do require, sort of a 911 intervention, as opposed to, and that creates a lot of anxiety and fear, and am I doing it right or not doing it right?
Yeah, and just the sleeplessness that happens for caregivers. They're exhausted because they're not always sleeping well, because they're worried, or they're up in the night helping take care, and they're often, working at the same time and trying to feel that they're being competent and capable there, and being able to balance that out and help them with. We talk so often about self-care, which is just sometimes a burdensome thing to also talk to caregivers about, because they're like, I don't even know what that means, and self-care looks like something different on any given day. Yesterday with the group I was with, like the self-care was going to be around this guy going and getting some stuff done with the lawyer, and that was going to ease his mind about something. Sometimes it's going out for a walk. But if you just Google self-care, you're going to get some woman in a lotus position on a beach, or maybe a cup of tea, and that is not generally. Those aren't helpful kinds of things.
You're right. Self-care may be someone comes in and sits with someone for a while, so you can go out with your friends. Or go to dinner, go see a movie, go spend some time with friends to talk about your own issues.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I invite you to talk a little bit about how doctors can either be helpful or not helpful when it comes to interacting with the caregiver.
I think one story that comes to mind was a woman in one of my groups one time who the physician said to her, "How are you?" And she was like, "Whoa, me?" Like, because she had felt so invisible in so many appointments. And that had really stayed with her, that somebody had recognized her and wondered about her. Which honestly, if you ask that question and you can get anything out of them, it will also give you more information about what's going on in that milieu with the patient. It will tell you more. If they're kind of edgy, you can get a sense maybe of something going on with the patient. So I think just even acknowledging, and complimenting them, like say, how's that going for you? Like you have somehow now become a pharmacist and a nurse and I'm astounded sometimes at some of my friends who have gone through these treatment things, and they can talk to you about labs and this and that and the other, and they're not professionally trained, but to acknowledge, like, wow, the capacity that you have built, like, I'm really impressed by that, because I think it also boosts a caregiver's confidence, but to be seen. And I think it's when there's just sort of like maybe assumptions that are happening there. I also think it can shut down the sense of the caregiver wondering if they can ask a question. Something is on their mind, something they're fearful about, something that they just wonder, or like, can we do this or whatever. But if there isn't even acknowledgement that they're in the space, they're probably not going to ask that.
Yeah, good points. It reminds me of things I said today to a caregiver. You're doing such a good job. I really admire the way you're handling this. And then the other sort of open-ended is, are there any services you're not receiving that we could bring on board, other team members to help? And sometimes then we get into a conversation about, home care, professional caregivers in the house, or around counseling services. And counseling services can be for the patient who has cancer, or counseling for the caregiver.
Yeah. I think, too, it's even from the outset, because I know that patients have their navigators, so they know what all the resources are, but I think when a caregiver can kind of know, too, here's the umbrella of resources that are available, and here, let's get you set up here. Let's make, even saying, many of our caregivers use these services. So it's like, it's okay. I'm not the only one. I'm not somehow weak or vulnerable. Yeah. Like, that vulnerability really is our strength, to say, hey, I'm needing something, and being able to ask for it. And then, wow, when there is something there, or it's the beginning of something, I think that then encourages people to really kind of build stuff out a little bit more.
You mentioned something, and I think, here's what I heard, that there maybe is even a national organization of caregivers, and so the idea that, yes, you are not alone. Here are resources. Obviously, there's sort of national resources, but it's incumbent upon us to also have local resources. What are some of those national resources, and then what would you say are some local resources that I might not be aware of?
When it comes to caregivers, there are actually quite a few national assets out there, and like the National Association of Caregiving, and they are they're an umbrella organization that will have they do some advocacy and policy stuff, but they can also do some things that are more related to specific illness, and kind of guide people in certain directions. Caregiving.com is a really good website that lots of people with lots of different backgrounds or needs, kind of go through there, and they can find some connections there. If people have dementia issues, one of my absolute favorites is the Purple Sherpa. And
The Purple
Sherpa.
Sherpa. I have
And
not heard of that.
Yeah, and I was gratified a few years ago. I was a speaker at a national conference for caregiving.com, and I was just kind of moderating a panel of visionary programs, and one of them was Julie from the Purple Sherpa, and I had been advocating with using her resources in some of my caregiving groups. Like, oh my gosh, I'm meeting the Purple Sherpa. But her father had dementia, and she runs online groups, and many of these groups too are private. You can be in a private caregiver group where you can talk about whatever it is you need to talk about. I would say on a local basis, I don't have a lot of competition. I wish I did. This is my swan song. If it's like I can plant a seed for a tree I never sit under, it's that we begin to develop more family caregiver resources here. I have my own small Facebook group, and I try to put information in that, and sort of seeding some other programs here and there, just groups that I've been able to get started. But yeah, and if anybody wants to contact me, I'm with a particular need or whatever, I'm happy to send them out. I would say.
How would someone reach you?
Oh, I have a website. It's
Okay, we can put it
in the show notes
into the chat
yeah,
box.
absolutely, because it's www.caregiverconnection.net.
Okay.
So, and it may sound weird, but there's really some wonderful, I know that Twitter can just be awful, but there is some beautiful stuff on Twitter. There's some great caregiver Twitter accounts, and there's some great Twitter grief accounts on there too. There's just people, they astound me. They break my heart wide open with their generosity. So, you can stay out of the crazy of Twitter, but there's some good Twitter that I've discovered.
So one of the other myths is that, insurance will pay for everything.
Big myth. Big myth. And that's where I think, too, kind of going back to the beginning, and sometimes you don't know, like caregiving can be foisted upon you in a heartbeat. And my husband and I have been through this where it's like, hello, Dr. So-and-so, and your sister has stage 4 cancer on the east coast of Virginia. Okay, let's book a plane. But you go and you're like, I don't even know if she has insurance. I don't know if she has a bank account, whatever. And we were very fortunate that she did, but it's it's understanding too what the resources are for a person and getting some of the documents in place. Doing that, you'll know a little bit more. But sadly, insurance doesn't cover everything. Medicare will cover hospitalizations and some of the outpatient stuff, and perhaps if you qualify for skilled care, and it will help with, like hospice care, but generally maybe some in-home care depending on the level of need, but generally those things fall to people and their own economies. And
it is, and even some things that might be covered, figuring out how to get whether it's durable medical equipment from a wheelchair to a walker to a cane, and it's even if the doctor is willing to do it, if you don't write the prescription exactly right, it's not going to get covered, and so it's very, to even know what you don't know is
and
impossible.
I used to be able to do that in my sleep, and it has changed so much that I have to say, I learn a lot from caregivers in my groups. I'll say, oh no, here's where you can go and get this. But at the same time too, sometimes just asking around, particularly if you're needing durable medical equipment, sometimes if you're on an app like nextdoor.com, you might say, like, we're needing a wheelchair. Does anybody have one we can borrow or rent, or crutches or whatever? And I have friends who have like medical supply stores in their basements because of all of their parents. Well, you never know when you might need this kind of walker or whatever. One woman whose husband had a brain tumor and was in hospice before she'd had a commode delivered to the house, and you couldn't return that to Amazon. It had never been out of the box, and she's like, what do I do with this? And so we suggested donating it to Easter Seals because they have a loaner program and stuff. So Yeah, it's really tricky.
Right, but you're right, having that network
Oh.
of other folks that are going through a similar situation, and
Yeah.
we
Here's where you can get this, or here's
Yes.
where you can get it cheaper, or people know. And as I say, they're not withholding from one another. Yeah.
One of the other myths you list was that we all know what we need and how to ask for it.
Yeah, I think because so often we feel like I can do this. You know, I'm so capable in so many parts of my life. You know, of course I can do this. I can just add one more layer on, and then there's one more layer and one more layer. And after a while, when people say, well, what do you need? What can I do? And it's like deer in the headlights.
How about 3 more hours in a day?
Yeah.
Could you give me that?
Yeah, and I think sometimes too, I think often we've been taught to ask more open-ended questions, and I think going to more yes-nos sometimes. If people are really sort of blanking out on you, say, could you use, if I bring a meal by, is that good for you? Yes. Then the open-ended part could be like, what day of the week would work best? Or do you have special dietary needs? But sometimes taking it to that level can be helpful, because sometimes too, we allow ourselves to receive something, we didn't know how badly we needed it. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's like when people had the opportunity to go for a walk or just be out, like, man, I had no idea.
What that was
Or
gonna do
how
for
I had
me.
no idea how tired I was.
Kathy, we've got a fairly large live studio audience, so let's open it
Yes.
up to questions from the audience. Any questions for Kathy? Yes,
Yes.
George.
What about the protocol for visiting hospice? Say somebody that you haven't seen for a while, somebody that you didn't go see in the hospital. Is hospice too late? I mean,
No.
what's the protocol?
I don't think it's ever too late, and I think that if there's somebody that you didn't visit and you want to visit, I think first checking with family to make sure that there's a good time, or just even the status of the person, because they may not be in a very responsive state. But coming and visiting, just even briefly, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and talking to them. Talk to someone and let them know, like, it's George and I'm here, and I care about you.
Yep, totally agree. And it does not have to be long. And
No.
It can not only provide them a sense of joy, the family, but it provides you this sense of joy, and it does not have to be long. But you might show up and they're watching a football game and you sit down and watch it with them for a half hour, or it might be they are asleep and they've just been given medicine and they're not going to be waking up, and you can just sit with them for 5 minutes and say what's on your heart, and knowing that they may in fact be listening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question. Have you ever noticed, like, culturally, when you're dealing with families? Because, like, for my situation, being the only daughter, it was culturally noted. You're to take care of mom. You're to be here constantly. Even at the hospice, they were expecting me to be there every day. And I had a job. I had, other things going on. But that was always expected. Do you ever come across that culturally from different diversity groups?
I don't know that I see it so much with diversity groups, partly because I think, and this is something I would really like to see a lot of expansion about, is more programming for diverse cultures, because people in different cultures know what those expectations are. I know what the expectations were from my cultural background, was like, yeah, you were going to be a caregiver. And it is. It's sometimes I think it is that sort of gender bias of, you're a daughter, you should be there. I think that those have been different for sons. Not that sons have been any less attentive sometimes, but it's, yeah. And so then if there's that expectation, sometimes you're like, well, okay. But nobody was checking to say, will you be coming tomorrow? It's like you're not being asked or being permitted as much as just expected.
Meanwhile, all your brothers are off fishing.
Yeah, basically. Or get yelled at, you didn't get here at this time, because we hired a caregiver, but she can only work a certain time, and I live 40 minutes away from where I work, and I go, I can't just go out and work, I'm a daycare teacher, you know? And, you know, so it was expected of me to do this, and I said, I'll pay that person extra. You know, it was just that cultural
Yes.
thing. If you went against it, it was like, how dare you? This is expected you in this culture to do this.
Right. And
You should have
it
other-
creates a lot of resentments in families, and sometimes those resentments don't go away. And that I see that where it can be a lingering thing that somebody, you know, can bring up and shiv you with later.
We have time for one more question. Poon.
Yeah.
Just to add, American Cancer Association or American Cancer Society
American Cancer
Yeah.
Society.
have a manual. So if someone doesn't like to be on the internet, they have a caregiver manual that the person can.
Great.
That's-
We have a speaker once upon a time.
That's a
So,
great resource too.
yeah.
You're exactly right. Not everybody wants to be.
So in case
Digitized.
everyone didn't hear that, the American Cancer Society has a nice manual for caregivers, and their website is cancer.org.
Org.
And you can access the caregiver information from the American Cancer Society. Well, this has been great. We could talk for a long time.
Thank you.
I know this is not going to be our last conversation. We're going to collaborate on bringing in some caregiver services to our cancer center. And I look forward to collaborating with you on that.
Me too.
So thank you, Kathy.
Thank you all.
Thank you to everyone who's here live. Thanks for everyone who's watching us live tonight. And if any of you know of folks that can't be here tonight that might find value in tonight's presentation, this will go on to the Above and Beyond Cancer YouTube channel tomorrow so that anybody can watch it whenever they would like. And it also will go on to the Mercy Cancer Center website. So thanks for joining us this evening. Again, I'm Dick Deming, Medical Director of Mercy One Cancer Center and founder of Above and Beyond Cancer. We hope to see you again next week. Thanks, everybody.